Eddard Stark felt the cold wind of the north even in the great stone hall at Winterfell. The news had arrived but a fortnight ago. His father, Lord Rickard Stark, and his older brother Brandon were dead by the hand of King Aerys II Targaryen. Such tidings would ordinarily be cause for fury and a thirst for vengeance. And indeed, part of Eddard's heart pounded with outrage and sorrow. Yet there was another part of him, perhaps the more reasoned, quiet part, that remembered the doom that rained down on House Rayne when they rose against the crown and against House Lannister. Eddard recalled the fates of many houses whose heads had made rash decisions. He thought of the realm as a whole. He thought of the precarious position the Starks were suddenly thrown into, with Robert Baratheon's anger at Rhaegar Targaryen for supposedly abducting Lyanna Stark fueling the fires of rebellion. Ned's grief cut deep, but as the new Lord of Winterfell, he considered the possibility that what had happened in the capital was not solely the madness of a king but a chain of miscommunications and old grudges. His father, Rickard, had ridden south demanding justice for Lyanna's kidnapping, and in response, the Mad King had called for a trial by fire. Brandon, in anger, had brought his voice and sword in hopes of demanding swift retribution, only to be trapped, choked, and burned alive alongside his father. All of Westeros seemed to recoil in horror, and Robert Baratheon, betrothed to Lyanna, called for war. Yet Eddard paused. His heart was battered, but not yet consumed by fury. If King Aerys had truly lost his senses, the realm faced chaos. Yet to turn the north into a battlefield, to join a war that might tear the Seven Kingdoms apart, might lead to an even greater catastrophe. He had seen the cruel winter storms that devoured entire armies. He remembered the stories of the Great Famine and the rising of the White Walkers centuries ago. The realm needed stability, or so he told himself. Could a single man's madness be reined in by the right alliances, the right environment? Was the entire Targaryen line to be forsaken and cast aside because of one man's cruelty? He paced back and forth in the godswood late at night, the ancient weirwood's face seeming to glare at him in judgment. He prayed to the old gods for guidance. His sister was missing, possibly in danger. His father and brother were dead. He had the entire north to look after. And while a large portion of his mind sympathized with Robert's cause, Robert was his friend, his brother by love if not by blood. He feared that the road south would run red with blood, that, in an attempt to save Lyanna, they might destroy half the kingdom. Eddard was forced to make a decision swiftly. One day, as a heavy snow fell upon Winterfell, he addressed his lords. Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, Wyman Manderly, and others came to hear how their new liege intended to react. Many expected him to call the banners and march south to war. Some, like Great John Umber, wanted that war with a ferocity that made their voices echo off the walls. Others, like Roose Bolton, only wanted to ensure the North's advantage no matter who sat the Iron Throne. Eddard announced, after much deliberation, that he would ride to King's Landing himself under a flag of parley to speak with the crown. The lords of the North murmured and rumbled with discontent, but the Stark name and Eddard's calm authority carried weight. He claimed he needed answers, that he would not risk the entire North's future for a cause he had not fully examined. As uneasy as that made some of his vassals, they recognized that, though young, Eddard Stark had a thoughtful mind. His father had once told him, "The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword," and to pass the sentence of rebellion and war upon the entire realm was a grave responsibility. Eddard would see the truth with his own eyes first. He would not rely solely on rumor and righteous anger. Word was sent to King's Landing. The Mad King apparently wished to see this other Stark pup. Perhaps Aerys was intrigued to see how the son and brother of the men he had burned would respond to his summons. Over the next weeks, Eddard departed Winterfell with a small retinue, Maester Luwin, a handful of loyal guardsmen, and the wise old Roderick Castle at his side. They rode south. The journey seemed shrouded in tension. At every crossroads inn, Eddard heard rumors of fresh rebellions, small skirmishes, talk of Robert Baratheon's fiery speeches in the Stormlands, and murmurs of House Arryn and House Stark standing with Robert in open revolt. But these were only rumors as of yet. The realm stood upon a knife's edge, waiting for the next move. When Eddard arrived in King's Landing, he was greeted by a sight that turned his stomach. The people were desperate, the streets filthy. Soldiers of the gold cloaks eyed the newcomers warily. Eddard traveled up to the Red Keep, heart hammering in his chest, uncertain if he was riding into a viper's den to be killed, or if he might truly find a chance at reconciliation. The tension in the throne room was palpable. King Aerys II Targaryen sat upon the Iron Throne, unkempt and wild, hair grown long and white, nails untrimmed, his eyes darting back and forth. At his side stood Tywin Lannister, expression a mask of cold politeness. The King's Guard flanked the hall, Ser Jaime Lannister among them, looking impossibly young. Ser Barristan Selmy's presence gave Eddard a faint sense of reassurance. If nothing else, Ser Barristan was an honorable man. Aerys stared at Eddard, the last living son of Rickard Stark in that moment, and demanded to know whether Eddard came to kneel or to rebel. Eddard, calm but resolute, went down on one knee. He declared that he came to seek justice and the safe return of his sister, Lyanna, and to preserve the peace of the realm. He was not here to declare war, but rather to understand. The Mad King gave a shrill laugh that echoed through the throne room. Aerys spoke of traitors, of how Rickard Stark had dared to demand the prince's head, and of how Brandon had threatened violence in the halls of the king. He called them would-be usurpers. Eddard clenched his jaw, swallowing the pain and anger. He met the king's words with as much composure as he could muster. He explained that Robert Baratheon believed Lyanna to be kidnapped by Prince Rhaegar, that the realm believed the Targaryens to be lost to madness. "But I have come to see if reconciliation is possible," Eddard said, voice even, though his heart beat loudly in his chest. "If your grace can ensure the safety of my sister and quell these fears, the North will remain faithful. Our words are winter is coming, yet we do not wish winter upon the realm. We only desire justice and peace." For a moment, a hush spread in the throne room. Tywin Lannister studied Eddard carefully, as though measuring him. The king's eyes flickered with suspicion and mania. Then, to Eddard's shock, the king beckoned him forward to speak more privately. Guards parted to let him approach. Aerys's breath was rank, his hair tangled, but there was an unsettling cunning in his eyes. He snapped at Tywin to leave them, as well as most of the King's Guard, save Jaime, who remained at the base of the throne. In low tones, the king demanded to know why Eddard truly came. Eddard repeated what he had said. He did not want the North to rise in open rebellion if a peaceful outcome was still possible. He wanted Lyanna returned, or at least the truth of what had happened with Rhaegar. He wanted to ensure the realm would not see a bloodbath. Aerys laughed softly, accusing Eddard of being a frightened wolf who had witnessed the burning of his kin. Eddard admitted he feared for the realm if Aerys's madness and violence continued. Yet, in that moment, something surprising happened. Prince Rhaegar entered the throne room, as if summoned by the tension, flanked by Ser Barristan Selmy. Rhaegar's face was grave, his eyes laden with regret. Rumors said Rhaegar had been away for months, or that he was chasing visions of prophecy in the south. Eddard could see that the prince had been away from the capital's toxic environment for some time. He looked less haggard than the courtiers around the king. Rhaegar's gaze fell upon Eddard with a certain sadness. Rhaegar asked if the North truly would withdraw its call to arms if certain conditions were met. Eddard hesitated, searching the prince's violet eyes. "If my sister is safe," he said quietly, "and if you can give me your word that the murders of my father and brother will be answered for in some manner, some form of amends or penance, if not from you, then from the realm, then yes. The North only desires honor and safety." Aerys made a shrill noise of protest, but Rhaegar approached his father and knelt before him, murmuring words too low for Eddard to catch. The prince then rose and turned to Eddard, saying that Lyanna was neither harmed nor abducted in the way Robert Baratheon believed. She had traveled willingly with him, bound by some secret that Rhaegar refused to state in front of the entire throne room. He suggested that Eddard be taken to Dragonstone, where Lyanna resided for the moment, so that she might speak for herself. Word spread quickly of the new Lord Stark's presence in the capital. Letters were dispatched, calls to parley began to swirl in the small council, and though King Aerys ranted about rebellion, Rhaegar began to seize some measure of control. Within days, Eddard was escorted to Dragonstone on a royal ship, accompanied by a small retinue and the watchful eyes of the Kingsguard. All the while, Eddard's mind spun with doubts. Could he trust them? Were they leading him to a trap? Or was Rhaegar genuine in his desire to defuse the conflict? Dragonstone loomed upon the horizon, its black walls shaped by ancient Valyrian sorcery. There, in a windswept chamber, Eddard found Lyanna. She was alive and well, though her face seemed more grown than he remembered, as if the last months had aged her. She ran to him, tears in her eyes, and they embraced. Eddard questioned her fiercely, wanting to know whether she had truly gone willingly or if the prince had coerced her. Lyanna's words came in a rush, explaining how she had fallen for Rhaegar, how she was dismayed at the betrothal to Robert Baratheon for reasons of her own. She had loved Robert as a friend, but she had doubts about how he would treat her, and she had met Rhaegar at Harrenhal. There had been something deeper, something that called to her sense of honor and prophecy. For a moment, Eddard thought this was madness. How could she betray her betrothal and the trust of the realm? But the sorrow in Lyanna's face was genuine. She did not realize the consequences would be so devastating, that their father and Brandon would be executed by the king's cruelty. She clutched Ned's hand, begging him to see that Rhaegar was a different man from Aerys, that Rhaegar might bring greatness back to House Targaryen, or at least stability. She knew that Robert and Eddard's older brother Brandon had misunderstood the situation. Ned felt torn between loyalty to his friend Robert and love for his sister. Yet the sight of her safe, though sorrowful, made him wonder if war was truly necessary. Could they not end the violence before it truly started? He had lost his father and brother, but at least he had a chance to spare the North from future bloodshed. Returning to King's Landing from Dragonstone, Eddard accompanied Lyanna and Rhaegar both. The prince seemed determined to face his father and put the realm at ease. But how could he do that if King Aerys would not step aside? Tension in the Red Keep was thick upon their arrival. King Aerys' paranoia was at its height. Ravings of burn them all slipped past his lips even as he held court with the lords. Tywin Lannister watched from the shadows, gold-flecked eyes calculating. Grand Maester Pycelle hovered near, half sycophant, half counselor. Varys, master of whisperers, scuttled through the halls in silence, seemingly everywhere at once. Eddard presented Lyanna to the court, so that all might see she was unharmed. He demanded that an official proclamation be made to quell the rumors of her abduction. Rhaegar lent his voice to that cause. The Mad King, in a moment of perverse whim, agreed to such a proclamation but insisted that Robert Baratheon must come to King's Landing and bend the knee for calling the royal family kidnappers and murderers. Letters were dispatched to Storm's End and the Eyrie, where Jon Arryn and Robert were gathering men. Eddard wrote one as well, urging Jon Arryn to counsel Robert that Lyanna was safe, that she had chosen this path willingly, and that King Aerys was prepared to offer a chance for peace if Robert would but come to treat with them. He did not hide his father's and brother's deaths. He made it clear that he hated the Mad King for that cruelty. But he also said that war might lead to tens of thousands more deaths, including the people of the North, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands. Perhaps cooler heads could prevail. First, there was no response. Robert, always quick to anger, called for vengeance, bristling at the suggestion that Lyanna was with Rhaegar by her own choice. It went against everything he believed. Lyanna was his betrothed, his beloved. He had conjured an image of her as an ideal maiden snatched away by the vile Targaryen prince. That day, when Robert read Eddard's letter, he is said to have flown into a rage, smashing cups and tables, shouting about Targaryen lies. Jon Arryn, however, read the letter carefully, seeing in Ned's words a genuine plea. He wrote back, urging caution and deliberation. If there was truly a path to peace, would not the realm be better served by it? Robert only grew more enraged, for the memory of Eddard's father and brother being burned alive still fueled him. But as the weeks passed, more letters arrived, this time from Prince Rhaegar himself, countersigned by the small council, though King Aerys' signature was suspiciously absent. Rhaegar told them the truth of his relationship with Lyanna, or the closest version of it that could satisfy the realm's demand for an explanation. He extended an invitation to Robert Baratheon and Jon Arryn to attend a royal court, guaranteed safe passage by the King's Guard. Then, in a deft move meant to ease tensions, Rhaegar promised to ensure a large host of neutral forces, such as House Tully, whose daughters were betrothed to both Brandon Stark and Brandon's younger brothers, would be present to witness the negotiations. Hoster Tully, father to Catelyn Tully, who had been betrothed to Brandon Stark, now dead, and to Lisa Tully, betrothed to Jon Arryn, saw the wisdom in peace if it could be achieved. Having lost the future bridegroom of his eldest daughter, he recognized that a single rash decision could plunge the Riverlands into chaos. Catelyn's betrothal would pass to Eddard if Eddard remained an honorable and stable ally. Tully, too, wrote to Robert, suggesting that perhaps they should at least hear Rhaegar out. Finally, after weeks of unrest, envoys traveled between Storm's End, the Vale, and King's Landing. Robert Baratheon agreed, reluctantly, to ride north with a small retinue, prepared to meet with Eddard, Rhaegar, and King Aerys. Yet even as Robert approached, word came that the king's temper was deteriorating further. Some said that Aerys was furious that his son seemed to be taking steps independent of the crown's authority, that Rhaegar was trying to broker peace behind his back. Others said that the king was planning a trap, that he had stashes of wildfire hidden beneath the city. Eddard's sleep was plagued by these whispers, but Rhaegar assured him that measures would be taken to remove any wildfire caches and to rein in the worst of the king's mania. Ser Jaime Lannister and others in the King's Guard quietly intervened to calm the king or keep him isolated when his rages grew too hot. In the end, Robert Baratheon arrived at King's Landing's gates, flanked by a small retinue of loyal retainers, among them a few knights from the Stormlands. Jon Arryn accompanied him, trying to keep Robert's temper in check. The air felt tense enough to snap. Eddard went down to the courtyard to meet him, wearing the Stark colors, flanked by Roderick Castle and some Northmen who had ridden south with him. Robert's eyes blazed at the sight of Eddard standing in the Red Keep. He demanded to see Lyanna. He demanded justice for the murders of Rickard and Brandon Stark. Eddard stood firm, placing a reassuring hand on Robert's arm, telling him that he too desired justice, but that they should speak in a calmer setting, away from Aerys' potential ears. He guided Robert to the solar that Rhaegar had prepared, a private chamber away from the king. There, Lyanna awaited them. The moment Robert saw Lyanna, he rushed forward, arms spread wide, only for Lyanna to hold up a hand. She looked troubled. She tried to speak, to explain that she had chosen her path, that she had fallen for Rhaegar, that she did not mean to hurt him. Robert stared at her as if she had grown a second head. He thundered that she had been bewitched, that the Targaryens were known for sorcery, that he would kill Rhaegar and free her. Lyanna's tears fell, but she stood resolute, insisting that no one had forced her. Eddard gently interceded, cautioning Robert not to let his anger drown out the truth. If Lyanna had truly acted of her own accord, how could war be justified now? Where was the wrongdoing that demanded the lives of thousands? Brandon and Rickard Stark had died to King Aerys' madness, yes, but how much more blood would be spilled if the realm was torn apart? Would that truly honor the memory of the Stark dead? Eddard's words were soft, but they cut to Robert's heart. Days stretched into uneasy negotiations. Robert found himself unable to accept that Lyanna would willingly turn away from him. Yet, as he spent more time near her, he recognized that something in her face, in her words, was undeniably honest. He saw the quiet affection that she and Rhaegar shared, but that only stoked Robert's bitterness and confusion, for he felt betrayed by the woman he loved, by the friend he had once counted upon, and by fate itself. Jon Arryn, old and wise, spoke with Rhaegar in private. He saw that Rhaegar was not his father. He saw that the prince's intentions might be to bring about a better rule, to overshadow Aerys' cruelty. Rhaegar explained that he had hoped to find a way to remove his father from the throne and take the crown himself, thus sparing the kingdom from his father's madness. He intimated that he had allies within the small council and within the King's Guard. The puzzle began to form in Jon Arryn's mind. Perhaps the best way to prevent a bloodbath was not to go to war, but to ensure Rhaegar's ascent as soon as possible. All the while, King Aerys was kept in the dark about these quiet meetings. He was left to fume in his chambers, half-guarded, half-coddled by Tywin Lannister and Pycelle. Tywin, for his part, was waiting to see which way the winds would blow, hoping to align House Lannister with the winning side. Tywin's daughter, Cersei, had once been rumored to be a match for Prince Rhaegar, but that union never took place. Tywin had resigned as Hand of the King in anger years ago, but he remained a power at court. A lull settled over the capital, but tension remained thick. People whispered that a single spark could light a wildfire. Rhaegar quietly arranged for a meeting with certain lords, Jon Arryn, Eddard Stark, Hoster Tully, and others who might form a coalition to force Aerys to step down. The plan was dangerous, and Eddard worried that the king might see them all burned if he discovered it. But Rhaegar insisted that the alternative was open war with the Stormlands, the North, the Vale, and likely even the Riverlands. Eddard listened intently as Rhaegar outlined a plan to convene a great council. There, the lords of Westeros could be presented with the truth of Lyanna's presence, the madness of Aerys, and the proposition that the king should step aside in favor of Rhaegar, who would act as regent. Perhaps they could handle it peacefully, especially if Prince Lewin Martell and other Targaryen loyalists stood by Rhaegar. The Martells had deep ties to the Targaryens, as Rhaegar's wife, Elia Martell, was from Dorne. This, however, introduced another complexity. Rhaegar was already married to Elia Martell, which made his relationship with Lyanna a scandalous secret. That complicated any official acknowledgement of Lyanna and Rhaegar's child, if indeed rumors of her pregnancy were true. Through back channels, Rhaegar reached out to the Martells to secure their support. Princess Elia, it was said, was a kind soul who might, under certain conditions, accept a political arrangement that would protect Rhaegar's children with her as well as any child that might come from Lyanna. Dorne was proud, and any slight to Elia could spark a Dornish revolt. This matter had to be handled delicately. Eddard saw that if this situation were not resolved with the utmost care, war might erupt from multiple directions. Time pressed on, and the day arrived when the king finally emerged to hold a royal court that included Robert Baratheon, Jon Arryn, Eddard Stark, Hoster Tully, and other lords. The great hall was full to bursting with tension. King Aerys glowered down from the Iron Throne, demanding to know if Robert would bend the knee and recant his slander against the Targaryen family. Robert, face like thunder, knelt stiffly, but only after Eddard squeezed his shoulder, urging him to do so for the sake of peace. Robert spat words of false apology, so bitter they seemed to curdle his tongue. King Aerys cackled, proclaiming that perhaps the realm would yet know peace, so long as these northern and Stormland dogs remembered their place. It was an insult that made Eddard's fists clench. He recalled his father and brother screaming as they died. But he kept calm, focusing instead on Rhaegar's plan. With the kneeling complete, Aerys called for a feast to celebrate the loyalty of these once traitorous lords. That night's feast was a tense affair, with the king at the head of the table, Rhaegar beside him, and all the major lords arranged below. Wine flowed, and the king grew more giddy. Then, in a moment that might have changed the entire course of history, Aerys stood up mid-feast, calling for a toast. He raised his cup and, in a voice that trembled with mania, declared that the traitors and rebels had finally bent the knee, and that was cause for celebration. But he also said that sometimes a burnt offering was required to keep the realm in line, that Rickard and Brandon Stark were an example to others who would challenge the might of House Targaryen. His words were vile, a direct gloating over the murders of Eddard's kin. A hush fell, and Eddard felt Robert shift at his side, felt the anger roll off him like a tide. Eddard placed a hand on Robert's arm, pleading silently for him to keep his composure. But Robert's knuckles were white against the table. The air was electric. Aerys, noticing the tension, smirked. He taunted Robert. "Do you disagree with your king, Robert? Or must I burn another wolf to remind you of your place?" That moment stretched like an eternity. Robert swallowed, his face reddening. But he did not move. Eddard recognized that if Robert so much as drew steel, they would all be slaughtered by the king's guard, who ringed the hall. Silence reigned until Prince Rhaegar abruptly stood and addressed his father. He spoke of the realm's need for unity, that the matter was resolved, that no further blood needed to be spilled. Eddard saw the flicker of defiance in Rhaegar's eyes. The king sneered but turned away, letting the moment pass. That night, Rhaegar, Eddard, Jon Arryn, and others met secretly in Maegor's holdfast. Robert was still fuming, his fists clenched. He wanted to kill Aerys. Any talk of waiting or a great council was an insult to him. But Eddard gently explained that if Robert or any of them moved now, the entire city could be put to the torch. The king still had thousands of loyalists and, rumor held, secret caches of wildfire. Thousands of innocent lives were at stake. Rhaegar insisted that the best path was to convene a great council of lords, with enough neutral parties present that King Aerys could not simply burn them all without incurring immediate retribution. Slowly, Robert relented, though bitterness gnawed at him. If not for Eddard's quiet, steady presence, Robert might have done something rash that night. Eddard felt a conflict within himself as well, for part of him wanted vengeance for his father and brother. But the deeper part of him, schooled in duty, wanted to prevent an outright civil war. Letters went out across the realm, calling for a grand assembly at Harrenhal, neutral ground that had once hosted the famed tourney that kindled Rhaegar and Lyanna's love. It was a symbolic place, though a ruin, and wide enough to hold many lords and their retinues. The king balked at leaving King's Landing, but Rhaegar persuaded him by citing tradition. If he refused to go, the lords might see it as weakness or madness. The king, paranoid as he was, still possessed Targaryen pride. He agreed, but only if a full contingent of the King's Guard came with him, and half the royal army. Summer was nearing its end when the lords gathered at Harrenhal. The monstrous towers of black stone loomed over them like twisted fingers. Tents sprang up on the broad fields beyond the castle walls. Rhaegar took it upon himself to reorganize the assembly's agenda. He insisted on speaking first, making a case that the realm needed stability. He spoke of the horrors that might come if any more houses rose in rebellion, of the tragedy that had befallen House Stark, of his father's sometimes unfortunate decisions, and of the better future that might dawn under a renewed Targaryen monarchy. King Aerys, glaring all the while, at first only watched in stony silence. Then came the calls from many lords, Hoster Tully, Jon Arryn, even some from the Westerlands, who demanded that the king address the murder of Rickard and Brandon Stark. The king answered them with scorn, claiming it was justice for would-be traitors. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the assembly. Eddard stood, speaking with a quiet authority. He did not accuse the king of injustice in direct terms. He knew that would be a death sentence, but he appealed to the realm's sense of honor. A man must have the chance to defend himself in trial by combat, and none should be burned unjustly. While the king sneered, Prince Rhaegar rose again, echoing Eddard's words, insisting that House Stark had been wronged, that some form of recompense was due. The assembled lords nodded in agreement, many swayed by Rhaegar's grace and sense of justice. The king could not help but be unnerved by seeing so many lords on Rhaegar's side. Next, Robert Baratheon spoke, his voice booming through the ruinous hall. He did not mince words. He called the king a butcher of innocence, rousing cheers from some Stormland and Vale lords, and he recounted how King Aerys had threatened to burn them all. Robert demanded that the king step down in favor of Prince Rhaegar, that the realm could not endure under the rule of a madman. The hall erupted into a roar of half approval, half fear. King Aerys' face went white-hot with fury, and for a moment it seemed he might command the royal army to seize Robert right then and there. But the number of lords in the hall, many of whom bore arms or had men-at-arms just outside, gave him pause. He was outnumbered if the matter turned violent on the spot. Tywin Lannister, who had attended with a retinue of Lannister knights, remained eerily quiet throughout, carefully gauging the mood. The Martells, present in smaller numbers, showed outward courtesy but also concern for Princess Elia. The Hightowers and Redwynes from the Reach looked uncertain, while House Tyrell's stance was quiet loyalty to the crown but also respect for Rhaegar. At last, Grand Maester Pycelle called for order. In his trembling voice, he reminded them that the realm had to speak in unity. Then, to the shock of many, Ser Barristan Selmy rose, accompanied by several members of the Kingsguard. Ser Arthur Dayne among them, the Sword of the Morning, and Ser Luwin Martell. Barristan spoke, his voice respectful but firm, saying that the Kingsguard was sworn to protect the king, yes, but also the realm. He expressed the sentiment that King Aerys' madness endangered the realm. Arthur Dayne bowed his head in agreement. A moment of hush fell upon Harrenhal. The king rose unsteadily, his eyes wild, and he yelled for his guards to strike down the traitors. But many of the Targaryen soldiers were uncertain. They had marched under Prince Rhaegar's command, and he was their beloved leader. A chaotic swirl of movement erupted in the hall, with some men drawing swords, others holding them back, while many lords shouted to restrain themselves lest a slaughter commence. Rhaegar stepped forward, his voice ringing out, "No more blood!" He called for calm, raising his hands. He declared that he, Prince of Dragonstone, was prepared to lead the realm in place of his father, who was unfit. He called for the king to retire, to live out his days with dignity in the Red Keep under guard, so as not to bring further destruction. He appealed to House Baratheon, House Stark, House Arryn, the lords of the Riverlands, the Westerlands, the Reach, and Dorne, to join him in forging a new era of peace. King Aerys' face contorted. He screamed about traitors, about how he would burn them all. He shrieked at Tywin Lannister, demanding the heads of these betrayers. Tywin said nothing, only lifting his chin in cold detachment. Then the king tried to command the gold cloaks of kings landing to obey him, but their commander only looked at Rhaegar. For a few awful heartbeats, it seemed as though all of Westeros balanced on a thread. One wrong sword thrust or one shouted command might plunge them into a whirlpool of carnage. But as tension built to a breaking point, Tywin Lannister finally broke his silence. In a measured voice, he declared that House Lannister recognized Prince Rhaegar's right to lead, and that he would lend the Lannister forces to ensure stability for the realm. At the same time, Ser Barristan stepped up behind King Aerys, resting a hand on the king's shoulder, gentle but an unmistakable restraint. Arthur Dayne and Jaime Lannister approached as well. The king tried to lash out, to pull away, but it was as though a net had been cast over him. The hall erupted in shouts, some of relief, some of victory, some of continuing anger. King Aerys was seized by his own Kingsguard, though half the guard looked on with horror and confusion. Yet the presence of men like Arthur Dayne, Luwin Martell, and Barristan Selmy gave the action a sheen of legitimacy. They were the noblest of the Kingsguard, revered throughout the realm, and they had acted. In the aftermath, the lords declared Rhaegar Targaryen the Prince Regent, to govern in King Aerys' stead until the king either recovered from his madness or passed on. In truth, they all knew this was a peaceful coup. Rhaegar was effectively king in all but name. Aerys, still screaming, was taken away, escorted back to King's Landing under heavy guard, forced to remain in the Red Keep. At Harrenhal, a stunned quiet followed. Many lords exhaled a sigh of relief, but what would come next? Robert Baratheon demanded satisfaction for Rickard and Brandon Stark's deaths. So did Eddard, though in a calmer way. Rhaegar, as newly invested regent, promised that the realm would see a measure of justice, though it could not undo what had been done. He offered the North compensation in gold, grain, or anything else needed to help the House Stark and its people recover from the losses. He also promised that the monarchy would never again subject the High Lords to the cruelty that Aerys had displayed. Robert still clenched his fists, but his fury was tempered by the fact that Rhaegar had effectively dethroned Aerys. Part of Robert's cause had been to free Lyanna from the Targaryens' grip, but Lyanna was not a prisoner. She had chosen her path. No matter how Robert cursed fate, he could see that a war would not bring her back to him. He turned away from Harrenhal, hollow and resentful. Eddard watched his friend go, torn between sympathy and relief that they had averted catastrophe. Thus, the rebellion never exploded into full force. Instead, Rhaegar consolidated power as Prince Regent, carefully enlisting the lords who had threatened to rebel House Baratheon, House Stark, House Arryn, House Tully, by promising reforms. He knew he also had to address the issue of Elia Martell and Lyanna Stark. The realm murmured about bigamy if Rhaegar took Lyanna as a second wife, or about the potential scandal if Lyanna became a royal mistress. The Martells, proud and fierce, would not abide a public humiliation of Elia. But Elia herself, according to rumor, quietly assented to an arrangement if it meant avoiding war, especially for the sake of her children, Rhaenys and Aegon. Dorne's lords, however, required delicate negotiations, with Rhaegar appeasing them by guaranteeing rights and titles for Elaya's children. Meanwhile, the matter of House Stark's new alliance was sealed when Eddard finally wed Catelyn Tully, taking up the betrothal that had once belonged to Brandon. The wedding took place quietly at Harrenhal, overshadowed by the tumult of the Great Council, but it served to bind House Tully and House Stark more strongly. Eddard's heart was heavy, for he mourned Brandon's absence, yet he knew the North needed stability. Catelyn, for her part, found Eddard to be quiet but kind. Their match, though not the one she had expected, was one she was determined to make work. In the months that followed, King Aerys lingered under guard in the Red Keep. Some said he spent his days ranting at the walls, others claimed he plotted an escape or dreamt of dragons that would burn the traitors. Yet with the entire realm united behind Rhaegar, Aerys had no real recourse. Tywin Lannister returned to King's Landing, reinstated as Hand of the Prince Regent. Varys continued to work his webs of whispers. Pycelle remained on the small council, as did other advisors. Rhaegar took active measures to rid the city of the wildfire caches his father had hidden. He also began efforts to restore the people's faith in the throne, reversing some of Aerys's brutal policies. Eddard Stark, free to return to the north, found himself in a position of uneasy gratitude. Rhaegar had effectively saved the north from a devastating war, and though Eddard still harbored anger for the deaths of his father and brother, he recognized that Rhaegar had done what he could to mend relations. Eddard was asked to remain in King's Landing for a time, to serve as Warden of the North, ensuring that the laws of the new regency were upheld in the region. Eddard agreed, though it meant leaving Winterfell in the hands of trusted castellans for a while longer. Robert Baratheon left King's Landing soon after, returning to Storm's End. He had no appetite for court life, and his dream of wedding Lyanna was gone. His resentment for the Targaryens smoldered still, though the impetus for outright rebellion had been snuffed out. Jon Arryn returned to the Vale, relieved that the land would not be consumed by civil war. In time, the realm experienced a tentative peace, though it was built on fragile foundations. The captive King Aerys was a constant threat in the background, for none knew if his supporters might try to free him. Moreover, the arrangement with Lyanna Stark remained a thorny matter. Rhaegar did not openly proclaim her as his second wife, but it was widely understood that she lived with him, separate from Elia Martell. Whispers circulated about the child Lyanna carried, perhaps the Song of Ice and Fire, that some had whispered about since the tourney at Harrenhal. People speculated on whether that child would have a claim to the Iron Throne or if he or she would remain overshadowed by Rhaegar and Elaya's two children. All these complexities swirled around Eddard as he remained in King's Landing, quietly supporting Rhaegar's regency. He found it uncomfortable to witness Lyanna in such a precarious position. Some whispered that she was a harlot or a seductress, but Lyanna, strong-willed as she was, met such gossip with her head high. She had made her choice, and the realm was at peace. In her mind, that justified what she had done. Still, tension simmered. The Reach, seeing that House Tyrell had not gained the favor they might have under a Targaryen with a different marriage, cast eyes askance at King's Landing. Dorne, though they had Elia as the Prince Regent's lawful wife, seethed at the shame of Rhaegar's affection for another woman. The Westerlands, smug now that Tywin was again at the center of power, quietly consolidated their wealth. The North had lost Lord Rickard and Brandon, and while Eddard was forging a new life as Lord of Winterfell, many Northerners still considered the Targaryens murderers. In that uncertain environment, Eddard made his presence felt by ensuring that the new policies Rhaegar enacted remained fair. He saw to it that the crown compensated the families of those who had suffered under Aerys' random acts of cruelty. He quietly befriended Ser Barristan Selmy, speaking often of honor and duty. He even found himself on speaking terms with Jaime Lannister, the young Kingsguard who had physically restrained Aerys at Harrenhal. He recognized the conflict in Jaime's green eyes, torn between loyalty to his father, Tywin, and his oath as a Kingsguard. Months turned into a year, and the realm did not fall apart. Instead, it slowly stabilized under Rhaegar's regency. Trade improved. Roads were safer as Rhaegar commanded the royal army to root out bandits. The small folk, who had long suffered under Aerys' purges, began to hope that better days might be coming. The lords, seeing that direct confrontation had been averted, quietly backed Rhaegar, if only because he seemed more reasonable than his father. A turning point arrived when news came that Lyanna Stark had gone into labor. Eddard stood outside her chamber in the Red Keep, heart pounding. Inside, midwives scurried around. Rhaegar knelt at Lyanna's side, holding her hand. Princess Elia, surprisingly, visited as well, though she stood apart, uncertain of her place in the room. After hours of agony, Lyanna gave birth to a son, a healthy boy. Rumor flew through the castle corridors that Rhaegar named him Aemon, after the Targaryen tradition. Others whispered he might be named Jaehaerys, or perhaps even Baelor. The final decision was Rhaegar's alone, but Eddard suspected it would be a name that symbolized both Targaryen and Stark heritage. Lyanna, exhausted but alive, looked upon her child with love and relief. Eddard entered the chamber quietly, seeing his sister's pale face shining with sweat, her eyes bright as she gazed upon her son. Rhaegar stood to greet him, cradling the infant. There was a moment, fleeting, where Eddard felt that perhaps some piece of the old anger and grief within him could be soothed by this new life. The child's birth inevitably caused ripples throughout Westeros. The question of his legitimacy was on everyone's tongues. Was he a Targaryen prince or a bastard? Rhaegar had not officially annulled his marriage to Elia, nor had he publicly taken Lyanna as a second wife. Some Septons argued that polygamy was not permissible in the faith of the Seven, though House Targaryen had a history of such practices in ancient times. Tensions rose, especially in Dorne, where many felt that the very existence of Lyanna's child undermined Elia and her children's claims. Yet Rhaegar remained resolute that both sets of children would be recognized. "They are my blood," he declared, "and I will protect them all." This precarious arrangement might have led to a fractured realm, had it not been for the loyalty Rhaegar had built among certain key houses. The North, grateful for peace and now led by a measured lord in Eddard, stood behind Rhaegar. The Vale, bound to Eddard and loyal to Jon Arryn, followed suit. The Riverlands, tied by marriage to House Stark, also leaned toward stability. House Lannister's power and wealth lent enormous weight to the regency. Despite Dorne's righteous anger, Rhaegar managed to keep an uneasy truce by promising that Elaya's children, Rhaenys and Aegon, retained their place in the line of succession. Aegon remained ahead of Lyanna's child. That concession soothed some Dornish pride, at least for the time being. King Aerys remained confined, occasionally subject to visits by Grand Maester Pycelle to check on his health. Over time, fewer and fewer lords asked about him. The Mad King was a relic of the past, overshadowed by Rhaegar's ongoing rule. It was whispered that if Aerys died under mysterious circumstances, no one would be surprised. Yet Rhaegar stayed his hand from outright kinslaying, an act of vile taboo. He chose instead to let his father waste away in a gilded cage. With each passing month, Eddard's sense of relief grew. War had been averted, at least in open form, and while there were resentments and complexities, the realm was not torn asunder. Eddard shared his time between King's Landing and Winterfell, traveling north in the summers and returning to the capital in the cooler months to attend the Prince Regent's Council. Catelyn gave birth to a son, Robb Stark, and a year later to a daughter, Sansa. Eddard discovered that fatherhood could bring him a solace he had never known. When he looked upon his children, he felt the sting of Brandon and Ricard's fate ease just a little. As the years rolled on, Rhaegar cemented alliances further. He hosted grand tourneys, inviting knights and lords from across the realm. At one such tourney in Lannisport, Robert Baratheon finally bested all comers, including the formidable Jaime Lannister, winning the melee. Rhaegar himself participated in the joust, unhorsing several skilled knights before being unhorsed by a young, rising tourney knight from the Reach. The presence of Lyanna Stark by Rhaegar's side set tongues wagging, but no one dared speak too loudly. The realm had grown accustomed, if not entirely comfortable, with the arrangement. And so, the shape of Westeros changed, pivoting around that fateful choice made by Eddard Stark. Instead of joining Robert Baratheon's call to rebellion, he had sought a path to parley and negotiation, allowing Rhaegar to unseat his father peacefully. The seeds of war had never blossomed into full rebellion. Yet beneath the veneer of peace, old grudges lingered. Robert Baratheon nursed his heartbreak and bitterness like a wounded beast. Though he acknowledged Rhaegar's regency, he spoke often in private of how the Targaryens had stolen Lyanna. He drowned himself in wine and ale and the arms of camp followers, drifting further from the honorable friend Eddard had once known. Now and then, Robert hinted that one day he might still raise his banners if given the right pretext. Dorne simmered with resentment over the slight to Princess Elia, even though she remained the true wife in the eyes of the faith. Prince Doran Martell, who had always favored a more measured approach, accepted Rhaegar's concessions in order to keep the peace. But Oberyn Martell, the fiery Red Viper, was not so forgiving. He considered Rhaegar's love for Lyanna a grave insult to his sister, and he itched to see justice done. Only the threat of retribution from the combined might of the Crown, the North, the Vale, and House Lannister kept him from open hostility. The Reach found itself overshadowed by the Lannisters' new closeness to the Crown, and Mace Tyrell disliked seeing House Lannister hold the position of hand. House Tyrell was loyal by custom to the Targaryens, but the current dynamic did not favor them as it once might have. The Tyrells murmured in Highgarden that perhaps, if Rhaegar's rule weakened, they should reassert their influence. The small folk, for the most part, rejoiced in the relative calm. They had dreaded a great war, and while taxes and corruption were still issues, they did not face the horrors of armies blazing across their lands. Trade thrived, especially with King's Landing no longer gripped by the king's violent outbursts. For Eddard Stark, however, the biggest change was within himself. He had always been honorable, always measured, but to remain at court, he had to learn a careful game of politics. He had to weigh every word in front of the lords and ladies who might twist any statement to their advantage. He found unexpected allies in men like Jon Arryn and Ser Barristan, and distant acquaintances in men like Jaime Lannister, who seemed starved for genuine conversation in a court full of duplicity. Eddard, having seen what might have been a cataclysmic war, kept reminding himself that all the tension and compromise at court was better than fields soaked in blood. He also cultivated a kind of working relationship with Rhaegar. While Eddard would never be wholly comfortable around the man who had triggered so many troubles by his secret relationship with Lyanna, he also recognized that Rhaegar had done his utmost to rectify the realm's woes once he had stepped into power. Rhaegar, for his part, seemed to value Eddard's honesty, the straightforward counsel that had no ulterior motive beyond seeking the realm's welfare. Many nights they would speak privately about how best to keep the North content, how to address roving wildling raids beyond the Wall, how to strengthen the Watch. Rhaegar understood that the North was vital. They were large in land mass and tough in spirit. Keeping Eddard on his side meant keeping the North loyal. Lyanna occasionally visited Eddard in Winterfell, traveling with Rhaegar in warmer months. She would pray in the God's Wood, her eyes distant and a touch sad. She confided to her brother that she missed the simpler days at Winterfell, riding horses with Brandon and Benjen, teasing little Ned. She had not expected her life to become so complicated. Sometimes, she looked out over the battlements and said that she feared the day their father's ghost might haunt her for the pain she had helped inflict, no matter that she never wanted anyone to die. Eddard only told her that he would stand by her if she ever needed him. After several years, King Aerys finally died in his confinement. The official cause was natural, though some claimed Pycelle or Varys might have helped nature along. Rhaegar, by then firmly in power, ascended as King Rhaegar Targaryen, first of his name. The coronation was a lavish affair in King's Landing, attended by every great lord and lady. Eddard and Catelyn came with their children. Robert arrived, grim-faced as ever, and the Martells came, flanking Princess Elia and Prince Oberyn. Tywin Lannister stood near the throne with an expression of triumph, for his family remained central to the monarchy's power. When the crown was placed on Rhaegar's head, cheers erupted. He raised his sword, said to be an ancestral blade of Valyrian steel, and promised to rule with justice and honor. If Eddard Stark had chosen differently years ago, if he had cast his lot in with Robert as soon as Rickard and Brandon died, the realm might have been drenched in blood and crowned Robert as king, or it might have ended with some Targaryen victory that left the North broken. Instead, the realm navigated a precarious peace. Some might argue it was the better path, for the Seven Kingdoms did not suffer the horrors of a long rebellion, and tens of thousands of lives were spared. Others would say that the seeds of discontent merely lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the day they might sprout into a new war. Indeed, as King Rhaegar's reign progressed, it was tested by constant intrigues. The question of the succession, the tension between Elaya's children and Lyanna's child, the ambitions of various houses that felt under-rewarded. Yet for the moment, the memory of how close Westeros had come to civil war, and the memory of how Eddard Stark, a quiet lord from the north, had stepped forward to parley instead of battle, kept the lords from tearing each other apart. Over the next decade, Eddard witnessed further events that tested his decision. He saw Robert drift into a bitter cycle of heavy drinking and aimless living, fathering bastards across the Stormlands. He saw the Martells stew in silent anger, muttering that Elaya's children were overshadowed by Rhaegar's affection for Lyanna. He witnessed Tywin's iron-fisted administration of the royal finances. He comforted his own wife, Catelyn, who found the southern court stifling and yearned for the north's crisp air. Yet for every moment of tension, there was also progress. Rhaegar invested in the modernization of the Royal Navy, forging alliances with the Iron Islands to subdue piracy in the Sunset Sea. He improved roads and sponsored new septs and temples to the Seven, pacifying some of the faith's concerns. He allowed the North certain freedoms in their faith of the old gods, not imposing the faith of the Seven upon them. He recognized Eddard's unwavering loyalty by reaffirming House Stark's dominion over the North, naming Ned Warden of the North, officially at a grand ceremony. In this new era, children from various houses met at King's Landing in a spirit of relative harmony, forging the next generation of alliances. Robb Stark, for example, grew up occasionally crossing paths with Aegon Targaryen or Rhaenys Targaryen at court. Their interactions were polite if not warm, overshadowed by the knowledge that their families' histories were interwoven in tragedy and uneasy reconciliation. Young Sansa Stark found herself fascinated by the courtly life of the capital, while Arya Stark, who was born a couple of years after the crisis, chafed at the confines of southern propriety whenever she visited. But these small glimpses of the future painted a Westeros that might avoid the cataclysms of outright rebellion, so long as careful steps were taken. Benjen Stark, Eddard's younger brother who had taken the black in the canonical history, might in this alternative path have chosen to remain in the North a bit longer, for the war never happened, and the sense of personal failure or shame that might drive him to the Night's Watch was less immediate. Perhaps he still chose the Watch eventually, out of duty or to find purpose. But the Watch itself found more support under Rhaegar's rule, as the king recognized the symbolic importance of the Wall. Could the realm, under Rhaegar, muster enough unity to stand against any threat from beyond the Wall, should it ever arise again? In quiet moments, Eddard Stark would ride alone to the black cells where King Aerys had once been kept, or to the crypts under the Red Keep where Rickard and Brandon's remains were temporarily interred before they were finally sent home to Winterfell. He would kneel in the dark, remembering their faces, remembering the moment the king toasted their deaths. He would recall Robert's howls for vengeance, and the swirl of emotion that nearly led him to raise the banners of the North. And in those echoes of memory, he would ask himself if he had done the right thing. He could not bring back his father and brother. He could not prevent the heartache Robert endured over Lyanna, but he had saved the realm from a war that might have torn it apart. Perhaps that was reason enough. Over time, as the realm remained mostly at peace, Eddard's initial doubts settled. The quiet joys of his life, raising children with Catelyn, training them in the yard, guiding the North's harvests, took root in his daily routines. Occasionally, he would travel south for matters of state, but he always welcomed the chance to return home to Winterfell, to the old Godswood where the Heart Tree's face bore silent witness to the passage of seasons. Still, seeds of chaos remained. Prophecies whispered by Rhaegar about the prince that was promised. The question of the White Walkers beyond the Wall, which most of the South dismissed as myth. The the smoldering resentments of men like Robert Baratheon and Oberyn Martell. The question of whether Rhaegar's complicated household would remain united or fracture under conflicting claims. Westeros was never a land free of intrigue, and as the years stretched on, Eddard knew well that peace was a fleeting thing, something to be guarded. He had once guarded it by refusing to let vengeance govern his actions. He might have to guard it again in days to come. In the far future, the realm might face new upheavals. Perhaps Rhaegar would pass the crown to Aegon, his son by Elia, or perhaps he would attempt to recognize the claims of both lines, sowing confusion. Perhaps the North would chafe under the Targaryen monarchy again if the Southern lords tried to impose Southern laws. Perhaps Robert, older and more embittered, would gather allies in secret to overthrow the monarchy he still despised. The future was unwritten. But one thing was certain. Because Eddard Stark had chosen to back King Aerys II Targaryen, or rather, to pursue peaceful resolution alongside Prince Rhaegar, Robert's rebellion never exploded across the Seven Kingdoms. Tens of thousands of lives were saved, fields remained unburnt, towns unpillaged. The cost was moral and personal for many involved, but the realm as a whole avoided the bloodiest of wars. Even the bards, years later, would sing of how the wolf from the north stayed his hand, and how the dragon prince rose to power by removing his own father, forging a compromise that might shape the course of history for generations. The wolf's choice, they might call it, spinning tales of Eddard Stark's journey from Winterfell to King's Landing, how he knelt before the Mad King rather than draw his sword, and how that single act of restraint altered the destiny of Westeros. Some would hail him as a hero for preserving the peace. Others would condemn him for failing to avenge his father and brother's murder in blood. But Eddard himself never claimed to be either hero or coward. He simply believed that sometimes, for the sake of the realm, a lord must choose the path that prevented the greatest tragedy, even if it weighed heavily on his own heart. And so, in that vast tapestry of lords and ladies, knights and small folk, fools and wise men, the North remained intact and revered Eddard Stark as a just lord. King Rhaegar's monarchy evolved into a new era, overshadowed by the memory of the Mad King, but guided by a man many believed to be destined for greatness. Lyanna Stark lived to raise her child, forging a tie between the North and the Targaryen line that might hold the kingdom together or, one day, be the cause of fresh conflicts. No one could say for certain what storms the future would bring. But for the time being, in that swirling sea of alliances, the realm could breathe easier, free of the fires of rebellion. In the quiet halls of Winterfell, sometimes late at night, Eddard Stark would run his hand over the stone figures in the crypt, stopping at the one carved in the likeness of his father. He would close his eyes, remembering those final days when word came that Rickard and Brandon were gone, hearing again Robert's vow of vengeance. He would remember the days he spent deciding whether to call the banners, and he would whisper into the cold darkness, hoping his father's spirit could hear, "I have kept our people safe, Father. I hope you can forgive me for letting your killer live, for bending the knee to a mad king. But I did it for the realm. I did it for all of us." And in the soundless gloom, the statues would watch him with empty eyes, offering neither condemnation nor absolution. Such was the shape of this new peace. Uneasy, laced with old wounds, but a peace nonetheless. If a single decision can change the fate of nations, Eddard Stark's choice proved that truth beyond doubt. He had backed the king. More precisely, backed the notion of preventing open war, and in so doing, he had altered the story that would have been told across Westeros for centuries to come. Where once armies would have marched under the banners of the stag and direwolf, forging a new crown upon the battlefield, now a silver-haired prince turned regent turned king held the realm together. Only time would tell if that tenuous union could endure the test of future winters. But for now, at least, winter had not come for the Seven Kingdoms. Eddard Stark rose from the crypts beneath the Red Keep late one night, brushing dust from his trousers and cloak. He carried a lingering heaviness in his chest, as he always did when he confronted the stone likenesses of his father and brother, which had been placed in the capital temporarily before their final journey to the Winterfell crypts. The corridors above were quiet, lit only by sparse torches. He walked in silence, thinking of how the realm had changed in the years since his fateful choice. King Rhaegar Targaryen sat the Iron Throne, having peacefully usurped his father, the Mad King Aerys, with the support, or at least the acceptance, of most of the great houses of Westeros. It was a precarious peace, one that balanced on the edge of half-buried grudges, but it held. And that, Eddard reminded himself, was better than outright war. He took a winding route through the Red Keep's halls, passing only a few yawning guards who recognized him and bowed. A hush enveloped the castle as most courtiers slept, but Eddard's mind was aflame with memories and questions, as it often was after one of his solitary visits to the crypt. Eventually, he found himself pushing open the door to a dim solar where a single candle burned. Inside waited Ser Barristan Selmy, still upright in his white cloak, as though he had anticipated Eddard's arrival. "Lord Stark," Ser Barristan greeted him softly, rising from a simple wooden chair. "Another sleepless night?" Eddard answered with a tight nod, closing the door behind him. "The crypt always stirs old ghosts. I had hoped the years would ease their grip, but—" Ser Barristan inclined his head in sympathy. "Memories linger, my lord. Even good King Rhaegar's new reign cannot wash away all the stains of the past." Eddard let out a breath and approached the table, where a jug of watered wine stood. He poured himself a small measure. "No, it cannot," he agreed. "And yet I suppose we can be thankful we don't have rivers of blood running from the trident to the neck. I doubt the realm even realizes how close it came to catastrophe." Barristan's eyes flickered with the distant recollection of that day at Harrenhal, when Aerys had nearly commanded his soldiers to seize Robert and the other lords. "Close indeed, my lord. But Rhaegar's diplomacy and your own, well, it changed everything. I know many men who are still alive because of the peace that was forged." Eddard Allo. What a faint, tired smile. "I'd like to believe that counts for something. We have at least avoided the worst." Barristan studied him. "You're thinking of returning to Winterfell soon, are you not?" "I am," Eddard said. "A fortnight from now. The king has said he will not need my counsel for some months, given the final settlement with Braavos is approaching, and Lord Tywin will see to the details." He paused. "But you know how these things go. If a single letter arrives from the Iron Islands or from Dorne that upsets the court, I may be summoned back south." Barristan set a hand gently on Eddard's shoulder. "Go home while you can, my lord. Lady Catelyn and your children will be waiting." Eddard inclined his head in gratitude. He took a sip of the wine, tasting its watered-down tang. "I will, though I must speak to the king before I go. There are matters of the Night's Watch that need attention." He hesitated, swirling the cup in his hand. "How does King Rhaegar fare, truly? I hear the whispers that he is weighed down by the tensions of his two families, Elia and Lyanna, Aegon and the boy named Aerion." "His name is Aemon, my lord," Barristan corrected gently. "King Rhaegar named him Aemon Targaryen, after the storied Maester Aemon of the Watch, or so the rumor goes. Some even say it was Rhaegar's way of binding the North more closely, as the old man was once a Targaryen prince himself, a distant uncle to Aerys." Eddard nodded, setting aside the misstep. It was hard for him to keep track of all the Targaryen names. Aegon, Aemon, Rhaenys, especially when his heart had never quite found comfort in seeing his sister as a royal paramour or second wife, whichever the people whispered her to be. Aemon, yes, the court gossips speak of him as though he will have some claim to the throne. Others say he's no better than a bastard, that Rhaegar's marriage to Elia was never annulled. They predict a succession crisis when Rhaegar grows old. Barristan's voice was quiet. "It weighs on the king heavily, yes. He tries to keep a delicate balance, ensuring that Prince Aegon remains recognized as his heir, while not neglecting young Prince Aemon, who is the apple of Lyanna Stark's eye. The realm sees him publicly treat each child with affection and respect, but the lords can't help questioning how all this will unfold in the future." Eddard sighed. "Yes, that is the heart of it. We have peace, but it's built on uncertain ground. Dorne resents my sister's presence, and the North, well, some of my bannermen still speak ill of the Targaryens whenever they gather. They have not forgotten the deaths of my father and brother." Barristan studied his face. "Nor have you, my lord, I'd wager. Eddard closed his eyes. No, nor have I. They spoke no more of it that night, and after a final exchange of courtesy, Eddard left the Solar. He picked his way back through the castle, lost in thought. By the time he reached his chambers, the candle had burned low. Outside the window, King's Landing's lights glimmered in the blackness. Eddard stood there for a while, gazing upon the city, listening to the distant roll of waves against the walls, and wondering what the future might hold. In the days that followed, Eddard attended a handful of small council meetings. King Rhaegar sat at the head of the table, still maintaining a regal grace. He wore a circlet of gold set with rubies that glinted in the torchlight. At his right hand sat Lord Tywin Lannister, still hand of the king, his presence cold and commanding. To the king's left was Prince Aegon, now a boy of about 10, quietly observing the council with watchful eyes. Varys scuttled about with whispers, Pycelle dozed off from time to time, and Peter Baelish, who had wormed his way into a minor position related to the treasury, offered sly suggestions regarding crown finances. Eddard mostly watched and listened. The main matter concerned trade with the free cities. King Rhaegar had expanded the navy, determined to keep shipping lanes safe from pirates. Next came the looming question of the Greyjoys, who had been acting restive on the Iron Islands, if rumors were to be believed. Lord Balon Greyjoy's father, Quelyn Greyjoy, had died not too many years past, and the new Lord Balon sometimes rattled his sword about independence. Tywin Lannister, stern as ever, reminded the king that the royal fleet could quickly bring the Ironborn to heel. King Rhaegar merely nodded, but his eyes flickered, as though the thought of more bloodshed weighed on him. After the council, Eddard lingered to speak with the king privately. He waited while Rhaegar exchanged a final few words with Tywin, then approached. Rhaegar turned, a faint smile curving his lips. "Lord Stark," the king greeted. "You wish to speak?" Eddard inclined his head. "Sire, I wish to request your official sanction for a new supply route to Castle Black. The Night's Watch struggles with manpower and resources. If we might coordinate with your fleets to bring additional grain from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower, distributing it along the wall." Rhaegar nodded, thoughtful. "I have been meaning to look into the Watch's troubles. Ser Osric of the Watch came to me not long ago with pleas for assistance. You have my leave, of course. Speak to the Master of Ships and see what can be arranged. I will provide a stipend from the royal treasury if Lord Tywin agrees it's feasible." Eddard almost smiled. "Thank you, Your Grace. The Watch is not what it once was. We have no pressing threat from beyond the wall that we know of, but winter will come eventually. It always does. Best we be prepared." Rhaegar inclined his head in agreement. "I'll not see the realm's northern border neglected." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Ned, how fares your sister? I've not had the chance to speak with her this morning. She was restless last night." Eddard schooled his features into calm neutrality. "I believe she is well, sire. She rides in the yard sometimes or visits the Godswood on the castle's outskirts. The city climate doesn't suit her. She misses Winterfell. Perhaps you might let her travel north for a respite." A flicker of sorrow crossed Rhaegar's face. "I would if she asked, but I sense she wishes to remain close to Prince Aemon. He's still quite young, only 5 or 6. And Elia, well, this arrangement is difficult enough without Lyanna seeking too much independence. Dorne would..." He halted, giving Ned a look that spoke volumes. "It's complicated." Ned nodded. "Yes, I understand, Your Grace." In truth, he did not fully understand, and he doubted many could. Lyanna had sworn that she had no regrets about following Rhaegar, yet Ned saw the loneliness in her eyes at times. The labyrinthine tensions with Elia Martell and House Martell as a whole weighed on her. But it was not Ned's place to question the king on these matters, not openly. "If ever she wishes to ride north, let her know I would be honored to escort her." "You have my thanks, Ned. I shall speak to her," Rhaegar said quietly. "And about your departure, would you remain a few more days? I have a mind to hold a small feast in honor of the new trade agreement with the Arbor. It would be well if you were present." Eddard nodded, though he suppressed a sigh. He had hoped to leave sooner. "As you command, Your Grace." Rhaegar placed a hand briefly on Eddard's shoulder, a sign of trust or friendship. "Thank you, my friend. You have my word. I will not keep you here more than necessary. You must see your young children." "How old is Robb now?" "6," Eddard answered with a faint, proud smile. "And my daughter Sansa is almost 4. Little Arya is 2, and there's another on the way." "Then you have reason enough to hurry home," Rhaegar said with warmth. "I will not delay you long." Eddard bowed, then excused himself. As he walked through the corridors, he passed Jaime Lannister, resplendent in his white cloak and golden armor, who tossed Eddard a quick nod of acknowledgement. Jaime had never warmed to Eddard, but a mutual respect had developed over time. Eddard also passed Prince Aegon Targaryen, the boy walking with a set of scrolls under one arm, a determined expression on his young face. He bore himself with a certain pride that reminded Eddard of Rhaegar as a youth, though Ned had never truly known Rhaegar's younger days. The burden of being heir apparent clearly weighed on the boy's shoulders. Eddard wondered if Aegon had formed any bond with his half-brother Aemon, or if the tensions of their mothers made that too difficult. The day of the feast arrived. It was a modest affair by Red Keep standards, meant to celebrate the success of a trade pact with the Arbor that would lower the cost of their wines in King's Landing's markets. Lords and ladies assembled, though it was not nearly as large as the gatherings for the grand tourneys of the past. Eddard attended out of duty, wearing the simple finery Catelyn had packed for him, a dark gray doublet embroidered with the Stark sigil on the chest. He saw familiar faces, Peter Baelish flirting with a young lady from the Reach, Pycelle nodding sagely over his goblet of wine, Varys slipping among the tables with quiet grace. The air was full of polite chatter and the occasional burst of laughter. The king presided from a high table with Tywin Lannister at one side, Princess Elia at the other, and Lyanna seated a step below. It was a subtle arrangement that reminded everyone of Elia's seniority as the king's lawful wife. Lyanna bore it with a composed face, though Eddard saw the flicker in her eyes that suggested this arrangement was never easy for her. Partway through the feast, Robert Baratheon arrived unannounced. The heralds barely had time to call out his name before he strode into the hall, broad shoulders clad in Baratheon yellow and black, face already ruddy as if from drink. By his side walked a few Stormland knights, equally large men with fierce scowls. A hush fell on the gathering as Robert marched up the length of the hall and bent the knee before the king's table. Rhaegar, taken aback, nodded in recognition. "Robert," said the king, voice carrying across the hall. "You come at an unexpected time. Rise, my lord." Robert stood, offering a short bow. "Your grace," he said with a forced politeness. "I had business in King's Landing and heard there was a feast. I'd not miss a good Arbor vintage." Rhaegar studied him. "You are always welcome, Lord Baratheon. Come sit, drink, let us share words." Another silence passed. Then Robert turned, scanning the dais with a set jaw. His gaze fell on Lyanna. For a moment, the years seemed to roll back, and Eddard saw the old longing in Robert's eyes, quickly eclipsed by bitterness. Robert bowed stiffly, then took a seat at a table near the dais, where Eddard was already seated. Eddard felt a ripple of anxiety. Robert's visits to court had grown less frequent over the years, and when he did come, he tended to glare at Rhaegar and clench his fists around his cups. "Ned," Robert said by way of greeting as he settled heavily into a chair. "Been a while. You look older." Eddard managed a small chuckle. "As do you, my friend." Robert snorted. "Wiser, I hope, though the years haven't been kind." He grabbed a passing servant by the sleeve and demanded a flagon of strong wine. Then, turning back to Eddard, he nodded to the dais. "I see your sister sits up there with the royal family. Do you think she's happy?" Eddard breathed in, trying to shape a diplomatic answer. "She is well enough, from what I see. She has a son she loves and—" Robert interrupted, voice low. "I, a Targaryen son, Rhaegar's whelp." His words held no joy. "I used to dream of raising a son with her, you know. I was an idiot boy back then, but still, I had my dreams. Do you still have your dreams, Ned?" Eddard pressed his lips together, choosing not to delve too deep into that painful topic. He placed a hand on Robert's arm. The past is gone, my friend. We can only shape the future now. Robert's mouth twisted. He lifted his cup in a half-toast. Indeed we can, and shape it I shall, if the gods grant me the strength. He eyed Rhaegar. He sits there all regal, but I see the cracks. The realm sees them too. 2 wives, 2 lines of children. Dorne hates him, the North tolerates him. The West kisses his boots, and the Reach tries to outshine everyone. Doesn't that sound like a pot ready to boil over? Eddard kept his voice level. Better a pot at a slow boil than a pot that's already spilled fire across the countryside. Robert let out a quiet huff, swallowing a large mouthful of wine. Well, that's what you always say. Peace is better than war, and maybe it is. But I'd have seen the Targaryens toppled if I had my way, if not for you. He said it without malice, more as a resigned truth. Yet here we are. Eddard inclined his head. He recalled the early days when Robert had tried to spark a rebellion. In those days, Eddard's decision to negotiate had changed the course of everything. Robert had resented him for it at first, and still did in some ways, but time had dulled the edge of that rage. Robert had turned it inward, into a sorrow he drowned in drink. I know, Ned said quietly, and I will not ask your forgiveness for it, nor do I think you owe me any. I did what I believed was right. Robert sat in silence for a long moment, then thumped his cup onto the table. I won't dredge it up tonight. Let's leave it be. I'm here to enjoy the arbor wine and at least pretend to have a good time. He cast a sideways glance at Ned. But I suspect I'll find a better time in the brothels of King's Landing, once the charade is done. Eddard had no words for that, so he merely nodded. The feast carried on around them, with minstrels playing a lively tune. The king exchanged polite toasts with Lord Redwine from the arbor. Tywin Lannister sat with the poise of a man who knew he was indispensable. Elia Martell inclined her head regally when spoken to, though her eyes flickered to Lyanna from time to time. Lyanna herself mostly avoided meeting Robert's gaze, and she kept one hand on her goblet, the other resting on her lap. Now and then, Eddard saw Rhaegar lean over to her and speak in low tones, presumably offering reassurance. Eventually, Eddard decided to slip away. He was not much for feasting or dancing, and the undercurrent of tension was wearing on him. He made his farewells quietly. Before he left the hall, he glanced back to the dais. Lyanna looked out across the hall, and for an instant her eyes met Eddard's. She gave him a small, grateful nod. Whatever else might be said of her, she had made her choice years ago. They both lived with it. The next day, Eddard prepared to depart for Winterfell. He sent a letter ahead to inform Catelyn of his journey and to let her know that King Rhaegar had granted him leave. The final matter was to confirm arrangements with the Master of Ships for better supply lines to the Wall. That done, Eddard mounted his horse in the Red Keep's courtyard. A small retinue of Northmen accompanied him, Roderick Castle among them, and a handful of loyal guards who had stayed in King's Landing all these years. Just as Eddard was about to ride out, Robert Baratheon appeared on foot, leaning heavily against one of the courtyard's pillars. He looked as though he'd had too little sleep and too much wine, but he waved a hand for Eddard's attention. "You're heading off?" Robert called. Eddard inclined his head. "Yes, I've been away from Winterfell too long. The king has given me leave." Robert ambled closer. He crossed his arms, regarding Eddard and his escort. "Ned, do me one favor." "If it's within my power," Eddard said. Robert exhaled. "Keep an eye on your sister if you can, from afar if you must. It might be that she doesn't need me or want me, but damn it, I still care. She's from the north like you. This city can twist a soul if you're not careful." Eddard felt a twinge of sympathy. "I do what I can, Robert. She has her son and Rhaegar's protection. But yes, I will watch over her." Robert gave a curt nod, then stepped back so Eddard's horse could pass. Eddard looked down at him from the saddle, remembering the countless hunts and tours they'd gone on as youths, the laughter and camaraderie they had once shared. That bond had strained under the weight of these last years, but it was not entirely broken. With a flick of the reins, Eddard started forward. The gates opened, and sunlight spilled onto the cobblestones. The party rode out, leaving King's Landing behind, heading north along the King's Road. The promise of home and family buoyed Eddard's heart. Winterfell was where he truly belonged, with Catelyn and their children, among the familiar godswood and the old stone walls that had seen generations of Starks. As the days passed, the air grew cleaner, the nights cooler. The land shifted from rolling plains to the rocky hills of the Neck, the boggy landscape that separated the north from the rest of Westeros. There, Eddard and his men were met by Howland Reed's envoys, crannogmen of the swamps, who guided them through safe pathways. Eddard greeted them warmly, thanking Howland in absentia for his continued loyalty. Howland Reed was one of Ned's truest friends, though their bond had formed more fully in this timeline through mutual respect rather than shared warfare. They had no great battle to unify them, but the memory of Harrenhal's tourney and the precarious politics that followed bound them. Once past the Neck, the weather turned colder. Autumn had a firmer grip here than it did in the southern lands. At Moat Cailin, Eddard paused to rest, observing the crumbling towers that had once guarded the north against invaders. He reflected on how those towers had never faced the southern armies in the war that never was. Sometimes he wondered what might have happened if he and Robert had marched south in open rebellion. Moat Cailin would have served as a bottleneck, but the Targaryen forces might have hammered it to rubble with dragonfire, had the Mad King been able to organize such an effort. Or perhaps Tywin Lannister would have marched the West's forces north to meet them. The labyrinth of possibilities made Eddard uneasy, so he let the thought go. They pressed on, traveling steadily until the gray walls of Winterfell came into view. Smoke curled from its chimneys, a reassuring sign of life. Eddard felt a familiar comfort uncoil within him at the sight. The gates opened, and the guards cheered their lord's arrival. Stable boys ran out to take their horses, and Eddard was greeted by Maester Luwin, plump and smiling in his gray robes. Servants bustled about, bearing chests and saddlebags. Eddard breathed in the crisp northern air and exhaled, feeling tension melt from his shoulders. In the courtyard, Catelyn Tully Stark waited, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak to ward off the chill. She smiled when she saw Eddard dismount, and he crossed the distance to embrace her. She pressed her cheek to his, and he kissed her forehead. "Welcome home," she murmured, eyes bright. "Thank you, Cat," he said softly. Then came the rush of children. Robb, 6 years old, a sturdy boy with auburn hair that took after his mother, ran up first, beaming. Sansa, a pretty little girl with Tully coloring, followed more demurely. Arya, only 2, bounded forward on unsteady legs, with a nurse in pursuit. She clutched Eddard's leg as soon as she reached him. He scooped her up, smiling at her unruly dark hair and bright gray eyes, so reminiscent of his own family's features. Soon, he would have another child, for Catelyn was expecting before the next year was out. He took them all inside to the familiar warmth of Winterfell's halls. Servants prepared a meal of hot bread, roasted meats, and thick stews. The children chattered about everything they'd done in his absence. Robb was practicing swordplay with Roderick Castle, Sansa was learning her letters and songs from Septa Mordane, and Arya was, by all accounts, a wild handful, forever running off into corners of the castle to explore. Eddard listened, content, grateful to be back among them. That evening, after the children were asleep, he sat by the hearth in his solar with Catelyn. She reclined on a cushioned seat, her hands resting on her swelling belly. He studied her face in the firelight. She looked well, her cheeks full, her blue eyes calm, yet he sensed a hint of worry in her. "You've brought half the burdens of the realm in your mind, haven't you, Ned?" she asked gently. He sighed, resting an arm on the chair. "I cannot seem to shed them entirely. How do I leave behind the knowledge of all that lurks in King's Landing? The tensions with Dorne, Robert's bitterness, the alliances that are more fragile than people realize." Catelyn set a hand on his arm. "You are home now, at least for a while. Let the weight ease." He nodded. "I will try. I had a letter from my father, Lord Hoster, 2 weeks ago," she said, changing the topic. "He sends his regards to you. He also mentioned that the Riverlands are quiet enough." Edmure is growing into his duties. Bryndon's gone off to the Vale, though, as usual, to visit Lisa and Jon Arryn. Eddard nodded. Good that the Riverlands are calm. They suffered even without a war, thanks to the uncertainty. We must keep them in mind if any trouble stirs. Catelyn gave him a wry look. You can stop being Warden of the North for one night, can't you? Relax. Enjoy the warmth of your home. Come to bed and be at peace. Eddard leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. Soon, cat. Let me poke at the fire a while longer. He offered her a small smile to reassure her. With a soft laugh, she stood, rested a hand lightly on his shoulder, and then withdrew to their chambers, leaving him to his thoughts. He sat by the crackling fire, eyes tracing the flames. He recalled again the face of his father, Ricard, the day he had left Winterfell for King's Landing, sure that a father's wrath would protect his daughter from the Targaryen prince. That memory was forever wed to the image of the mad king on the throne, crowing about how he had burned Eddard's kin. Eddard knew that few men could have set aside vengeance in that moment. Perhaps fewer still would have survived to see these days of precarious calm if the rebellion had sparked. So many times he had wrestled with the same question. Did he do the right thing? Always he came to the same conclusion. It was not perfect, but it was better than the horror that war would have unleashed. When the fire burned low, he at last rose, stretched, and went to bed, letting the warmth of home lull him into a deep sleep. In the following weeks, life in the north resumed its steady rhythm. Eddard made the rounds of Winterfell's courtyard, inspecting the training of the guards, conferring with Roderick Castle about the readiness of the men-at-arms, and meeting with the Castellan about the state of the granaries. Maester Luwin advised him on ravens received from the south. One message bore Tywin Lannister's sigil, curtly reminding Eddard that the king expected some updated figures on the cost of the new supply routes to the wall. Another letter came from Jon Arryn in the Vale, offering polite greetings and news that the Vale's harvest had been bountiful this year. Eddard penned replies in careful, measured words. He spent ample time with his children, teaching Robb the basics of swordsmanship in the courtyard, or listening to Sansa recite a new verse she'd learned from the Septa. Arya toddled after them, insisting on having her own little wooden sword. The sight made Eddard chuckle, though Catelyn fussed that Arya was too young for such pursuits. Eddard took a gentler approach, letting Arya hold the small sword for a moment, then coaxing her to join Sansa in a new game. But Arya's eyes lit up more at the little sword than at dollies or singing. Eddard could sense that she had a spark in her. Some wild part of her mother's Tully spirit fused with the fierce independence of the Starks. Late one afternoon, as he and Robb finished a training bout, the winter sky gray above them, a horn sounded at the gates. A messenger rode in, bearing the sigil of House Reed. Eddard went to meet him, worried that something might have happened in the neck. But the messenger's news, relayed breathlessly, was of a different kind of trouble. "My lord," the messenger said, dismounting in a swirl of cloaks, "I bring word from Howland Reed that Ironborn raiders have been spotted sailing near the Fever River, not far from the borders of the Neck. They have not attacked yet, but they are an ominous sight. Lord Reed begs you to consider fortifying the region." Eddard frowned. The Ironborn seldom ventured so far inland. Balon Greyjoy must be testing the waters, seeing if the realm's navy would respond. Eddard thanked the messenger and dismissed him to rest. Afterward, Eddard convened with Roderick Castle, Maester Luwin, and some of his more senior officers. They discussed whether to send men to the marshes or to keep them in reserve at Moat Cailin, or perhaps dispatch a raven to the king for instructions. In the end, Eddard decided to do both. He would send a small contingent to reinforce Howland Reed's standing forces, and he would also send word to King's Landing. If the Ironborn were growing bold, this might not be an isolated incident. The raven to King's Landing bore Eddard's seal and carried a concise report that Ironborn vessels had been sighted near the Neck. Eddard expressed his concern, wondering if Lord Balon Greyjoy might be testing the kingdom's defenses. The response came a few days later, penned in a firm, elegant hand that Eddard recognized as the king's own. "My Lord Stark, I have received your warning about the Ironborn. Lord Tywin and I have conferred. We shall send a warning to Pike that any raids on mainland shores will be met with swift retaliation. Please maintain a vigilant watch in the north. I shall see that the Royal Navy patrols the coast around Cape Kraken and the Iron Islands. I do not wish for blood to be spilled, yet we cannot tolerate lawlessness. The realm must know we are strong and united. In the light of the Seven and with the blessing of the old gods, Rhaegar Targaryen, King of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. Eddard showed the letter to Roderick Castle, who nodded. The king's words are firm, Roderick said. Perhaps it will keep Balon Greyjoy from acting. The Ironborn respect only strength, as you know, my lord. Eddard placed the letter aside. Let us hope it's enough. I have no wish to see warships in the Sunset Sea. But if Balon Greyjoy thinks he can carve out independence, he might try his luck. In the weeks that followed, news trickled in that a small royal fleet had indeed sailed north from the city, collecting forces from Lannisport on the way, enough ships to make a show of strength. Rumor was that Prince Aegon, at 10 years of age, had joined the fleet in a ceremonial capacity, under the watchful guard of Ser Barristan Selmy. Eddard was glad to see the king act decisively but worried all the same. Whenever the crown flexed its power, it risked provoking those with rebellious inclinations. Yet for a time, the Iron Islands remained quiet, evidently cowed by the sight of so many war galleys. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter, and the nights grew cold. In the far north, beyond the wall, the first true snows had begun to fall, or so the reports from Castle Black said. Eddard organized additional grain deliveries, as promised, ensuring the ships at Eastwatch were stocked. The rest of his days he devoted to the governance of the north, mediating disputes between minor lords, ensuring the roads were safe for traveling merchants. He also set aside time each evening for his children, telling them stories of the knights of old or the kings of winter from Stark history. Eventually, word arrived from King's Landing that King Rhaegar planned a great tourney in the coming spring to honor the second name day of his son, Prince Aemon. Eddard set the Raven aside with a sigh. He remembered the last time Harrenhal had hosted a great tourney and all that had sprung from it. Still, to refuse an invitation from the king would be unthinkable. He resolved to travel south when the time came, but only with a small escort. He did not relish leaving the north for too long. Winterfell prepared for winter's onset, storing food and furs, but the autumn stretched on with mild weather. Some wondered if the gods were granting a longer respite before the next real snow. Eventually, the new year turned. Catelyn gave birth to a boy, Bran Stark, who arrived in late winter, healthy and strong. Eddard was overjoyed, and so were Robb, Sansa, and Arya, who doted on their baby brother. The castle bustled with celebrations, a small feast in honor of the new heir. One crisp morning, not long after Bran's birth, Eddard stood on the ramparts, looking out over the white-tipped forests. The hush of the north soothed him. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Benjen Stark. In this timeline, Benjen had not taken the Black after the tragedy of the rebellion, because the rebellion never truly happened. Instead, he had spent his time between Winterfell and the wilderness, occasionally venturing to the Wall out of curiosity, but never joining the Watch. Benjen gave his older brother a broad grin. "You look content, Ned." Eddard nodded. "I am, for the moment. You've been gone a while, Benjen. Did you travel to the last hearth?" I did. Then I ventured even further north, visiting the hill clans. Some of them talk of odd lights in the night sky, but that's likely just their old superstitions. I also spent time with the Night's Watch Rangers on a short ranging beyond the wall. No sign of White Walkers, if that's what concerns you. Eddard half smiled. The others are a legend, or so the South would have us believe. Still, keep your eyes open, Benjen. I'd rather not be caught off guard. Benjen nodded. You're beginning to sound like the Watch. Perhaps I should join them, or perhaps I should remain here in Winterfell, not sure which would better ease your mind. Eddard placed a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. Stay or go as you wish, Benjen. You are always welcome here, but the Watch could use strong men like you. It's your choice. Benjen shrugged lightly, turning to gaze out at the snow-laden horizon. I'll think on it. At times, I feel drawn to the wall. Maybe I crave that sense of purpose. Or maybe I just like the adventure." A comfortable silence settled between them, the wind ruffling their cloaks. Down in the courtyard, a stable boy led a horse toward the stables, and smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys. Eddard felt a deep sense of belonging here, an anchor in a world of shifting alliances. Eventually, the snows melted, and the promise of spring came. A raven from King's Landing arrived, bearing the official schedule for the grand tourney. Eddard read it over and saw that it would be held at Lannisport, not Harrenhal. Apparently, the king and Lord Tywin had arranged to use the gold-rich city by the Western Sea as the stage for celebrating Prince Aemon's second name day. Lords from all over the realm were invited. The letter made it clear that attendance was expected if possible, as it was both a celebration and a demonstration of the realm's unity under King Rhaegar. Catelyn, still recovering from childbirth, decided she would remain in the north with the newborn Bran and little Arya. Robb and Sansa would accompany Eddard on the journey south, at the king's invitation. Eddard suspected Rhaegar wanted to see how the next generation of lords and ladies mingled, forging early friendships or rivalries that might shape the realm in years to come. With a small retinue, Eddard set out in early spring. Robb, enthusiastic and bright-eyed at the prospect of a grand tourney, chattered with excitement. Sansa was equally thrilled at the thought of the pageantry and the knights in shining armor, the ladies in flowing gowns. Eddard felt a mixture of paternal pride and foreboding, remembering how the tourney at Harrenhal had set the realm onto the path that led to so much upheaval. He prayed to the old gods that this tourney would not spark fresh chaos. As they traveled south along the King's Road, winter loosened its grip, the air turning milder with each league. Trees budded with new leaves, and wildflowers dotted the meadows. By the time they reached the riverlands, the warmth of spring was evident, streams gurgling with snowmelt. They paused at Riverrun to pay respects to Hoster Tully, who was pleased to see his grandchildren. Sansa and Robb enjoyed meeting their cousins. Edmure Tully was still unmarried, but the castle was full of younger cousins and wards. After a few days, Eddard continued on, mindful of time. The King's Road eventually led them to the crossroads, and from there, they took a western route toward the rolling hills of the Westerlands. Lannisport shimmered on the horizon, a grand city by the sea, overshadowed by the massive Casterly Rock. Golden lions adorned the gates, and the port bristled with merchant ships and war galleys. The banners of House Lannister were everywhere, crimson fields with golden lions roaring, and amidst them flew the Targaryen three-headed dragon, signifying the king's presence. They entered Lannisport in a procession. Trumpets sounded, crowds lined the streets. Robb and Sansa looked about in wonder at the bustling city. Eddard found it gaudy compared to Winterfell, but he held his composure, greeting Lannister officials with courtesy. They were shown to quarters in a large manor near the western walls of the city, a place assigned to them by King Rhaegar's stewards. Knights, lords, and ladies from all corners of Westeros crowded the streets. Eddard glimpsed the banners of House Tyrell, House Redwyne, House Martell, House Tarly, even some from the Vale and the Stormlands. And of course, the gold cloaks from King's Landing were here in force, as were contingents of the royal army, ensuring everything remained orderly. The opening ceremony took place in a vast field outside the city walls, where pavilions had been erected in a ring around the lists. Eddard guided Robb and Sansa through the throng, eventually finding seats in a specially designated enclosure near the royal dais. Robb's eyes gleamed at the sight of so many knights, their armor polished to mirror brightness. Sansa clutched his arm, excited by the colorful banners and the courtly spectacle. Trumpeters sounded a fanfare, and heralds announced the arrival of King Rhaegar Targaryen. He rode in on a silver stallion, clad in gleaming plate chased with gold. His cloak was a swirl of black and red, the Targaryen colors. Beside him rode Prince Aegon, now about 11, looking serious on a fine black horse of his own. On Rhaegar's other side was Prince Aemon, too young to ride alone, carried before a mounted Kingsguard knight, Ser Barristan Selmy, no doubt. Following them was a retinue that included Queen Elia Martell in a grand litter, as well as Lyanna Stark Targaryen, if that was how the realm styled her. riding a pale mare, her long brown hair trailing in the breeze. The crowd erupted in cheers at the sight of the king. Rhaegar reined his horse to a halt before a large wooden platform that had been erected for the royal family. He dismounted with a fluid grace, handing the reins to a groom. Then he turned, helping young Prince Aemon down from Barristan's arms. The little boy clung to Rhaegar's leg, wide-eyed at the sea of people, but Rhaegar murmured something to soothe him. The boy wore a small surcoat of black and red, embroidered with the three-headed dragon, and on his chest was a lone direwolf stitched in silver thread, a subtle nod to his mother's lineage. Eddard felt a twist in his chest, seeing that wolf insignia. Part of him felt pride that his sister's child was recognized in some measure. Another part of him felt that it only emphasized the complicated nature of Rhaegar's family. Next, the heralds announced the official reason for the tourney: to honor the second name day of Prince Aemon Targaryen. The boy was lifted onto a small seat of honor on the dais, between Elia Martell and Lyanna, each woman adopting a carefully measured posture, with Rhaegar standing behind them. The tension between the two women was not overt, but Eddard imagined it was never truly absent. Elaya's children, Rhaenys and Aegon, were also present on the dais. Rhaenys, older by several years, took the role of a kind older sister, smiling politely at little Aemon, though Eddard could not read the true feelings behind her courteous expression. Aegon, the official heir, stood near his father with a princely bearing that seemed beyond his years. Soon the jousting commenced. Famous knights from across Westeros entered the lists, each eager to display their prowess for the king. Eddard watched as lances shattered and horses thundered down the field. Robb was enraptured. Sansa gasped and clapped, enthralled by the pageantry. Eddard recognized some of the competitors. Ser Jaime Lannister, still youthful and famed for his skill, unhorsed several challengers. Ser Loras Tyrell, a newcomer from the Reach, astonished the crowd with his speed and precision. Other knights rose and fell, battered but not gravely injured, thanks to the skill of the participants and the care with which the justs were run. In the midst of the spectacle, Eddard felt an ache of memory. The last time Rhaegar had crowned a queen of love and beauty, it had been Lyanna. That act had ignited the whole realm's tensions. He wondered if Rhaegar would dare repeat such a gesture here. But as the finals approached, Rhaegar was not among the justers, he only observed. The final tilt was between Ser Jaime Lannister and Ser Loras Tyrell. Steel rang on steel and the crowd roared. In the end, Ser Jaime prevailed, striking a decisive blow that sent Loras tumbling from his horse. Trumpets blared, and Jaime rode before the royal dais to receive his laurels. Rhaegar nodded regally, then glanced toward the women in attendance: Elia, Lyanna, and the assembled highborn ladies. Eddard's heart tensed. Would there be a gesture? But Jaime simply bowed, proclaiming that the day was in honor of Prince Aemon, and so the victory was the child's. The boy looked at Jaime with wide, curious eyes, uncertain of what to do. Lyanna or Elia murmured instructions, and the boy managed a shy smile. The crowd applauded, though some seemed disappointed that no crown of winter roses or any such drama was invoked this time. Eddard exhaled, relieved. One crisis averted. When the jousting ended for the day, the king announced a grand feast in Lannisport's main square that evening. People dispersed to refresh themselves and prepare for the festivities. Eddard led Robb and Sansa from the stands, weaving through the throng. He wondered if Robert Baratheon would appear again, as he had at the Arbor Feast. He had not yet seen the stag banners in the city, which was unusual. Possibly Robert had chosen to ignore this tourney altogether. Or perhaps he was lurking somewhere in the mass of lords and knights. That evening, Eddard and his children attended the feast, marveling at the Lannister wealth on display. Golden candelabras, red and gold penna, NTS draping the walls, lavish dishes of roasted boar, spiced beef, seafood from the Sunset Sea, and every manner of sweet imaginable. Music filled the air, the hall crowded with 1,000 courtiers. Eddard wore a simple black and gray ensemble with the stark direwolf emblazoned on the breast. Robb and Sansa were wide-eyed at the opulence. They sat near Eddard, nibbling at the extravagant fare. Across the room, King Rhaegar presided at a high table, with Elia on one side and Lyanna on the other, the children arranged between them. Tywin Lannister was prominently seated, looking like a stern sentinel. Various great lords orbited them. Mace Tyrell, Doran Martell, Randall Tarly, Kevin Lannister, Hoster Tully, and others. The chatter was loud. The wine flowed freely. Eddard exchanged polite words with some lesser lords who approached, each wanting a moment with the famously reserved Lord of Winterfell. He forced himself to engage in the courtesies, though he found the gossip tiresome, who was betting whom, which houses were forging alliances, what the crown planned next. Now and then, he spotted a flicker of motion in the corner of his eye. Varys, the master of whisperers, gliding among the tables with a soft smile. Before long, Sansa tugged at Eddard's sleeve. "Father, may I go closer to the musicians? I'd like to see them play." He nodded. "Very well, but stay where I can see you, and take Septa Mordain with you." She clapped her hands in excitement and hurried off, the Septa following. Robb remained, finishing a plate of roasted fowl. Suddenly, a hush spread through the hall as King Rhaegar rose, lifting his cup. Conversations died away, and all eyes turned to the dais. Rhaegar surveyed the crowd with a regal calm. "My lords and ladies, I wish to thank you for gracing this tourney to honor my son, Prince Aemon. You have traveled far and wide to show your devotion. I raise my cup to the unity of this realm. Long may we remain at peace." A chorus of cheers rang out, though the word peace carried multiple undercurrents in a realm still filled with old grudges. Rhaegar continued, "As you know, we stand upon the cusp of a new generation. Our children shall inherit these 7 kingdoms, forging new bonds. Let us remember that we are one people under one crown, no matter what differences may linger. And now, let us return to our feast." The applause died down, and conversation resumed. Eddard took a sip of watered wine, reflecting on the king's words. Rhaegar's aspiration for unity was genuine. Yet Eddard knew that beneath the veneer of courtesy and the lull of peace, lords like Balon Greyjoy or perhaps even the Martells might still hold ambitions. The next generation might find themselves faced with conflicts Rhaegar could not yet foresee. At length, the king beckoned Eddard forward with a small gesture. Eddard rose, leaving Robb to finish his meal, and made his way through the crowd, climbing the few steps to the high table. Tywin Lannister watched him approach with cool disinterest. Elia Martell acknowledged him with a faint nod, and Lyanna offered him a quick, tense smile. Rhaegar leaned toward him, voice low so only those closest could hear. "Lord Stark, I wanted to see how your journey was, and to let you know that tomorrow, there will be a small council meeting of sorts in the Lannister Solar. We must discuss the Ironborn situation and the question of taxes for the new fleets. I would have you present." Eddard inclined his head. "Of course, your grace. I will attend." Rhaegar gave a faint smile. "I value your counsel, Ned. You speak plainly, and that is a rare gift in these halls." "I only hope my counsel serves the realm," Eddard replied. He hesitated, then ventured, "How fares the prince?" "Young Aemon seems well." Rhaegar looked down at his son, who was fiddling with a small silver fork. The boy wore a miniature tunic of black and red, and his eyes darted up at the crowd. "He fares well, though a bit overwhelmed by all this attention," the king said softly. "And your sister is... well, you can see she is safe." He gave a subtle nod to Lyanna, who kept her gaze on Eddard. Eddard turned to speak to Lyanna, but before he could, Tywin Lannister's cold voice cut in. "Lord Stark, a pleasure to see you again. I trust you found the road safe." Eddard schooled his features and gave Lord Tywin a polite nod. "Yes, safe enough, Lord Hand. The realm is calm." Tywin's green eyes flickered. "Calm for now," he said, swirling his wine. "We shall see how long that calm persists." Rhaegar shot Tywin a faintly reproachful look. "Let us not darken the feast, my lord. Tomorrow we can speak of practical matters. Tonight is for celebration." "Yes, your grace," Tywin said, inclining his head with precisely the right measure of respect. Eddard turned slightly to face Lyanna at last. She wore a gown of deep gray trimmed with red, echoing both Stark and Targaryen colors. Her hair, as always, was unbound, framing her face. Her features had gained a maturity over the years. She was a woman now, mother to a prince, yet Eddard could still see the girl who once raced horses across the Winterfell fields. "Ned," she said quietly, standing so she could speak more freely. "I'm glad you came. I've missed you." He nodded. "And I you. Are you well?" She paused, flicking her eyes toward Elia Martell, who was conversing with a nearby lord. Then she exhaled softly. "As well as I can be. My son grows strong. Rhaegar." She glanced at the king. "He tries. I don't doubt he cares for Elia and her children just as much as for me and Aemon. There's no easy solution, but we manage." Eddard placed a hand lightly on her arm. "If you ever need me, you know where to find me. Winterfell is always home to you." She gave him a sad, grateful smile. "Thank you, Ned." At that moment, a young page approached, bowing and offering wine. Eddard declined. He felt the need to return to his children. Sansa was somewhere in the crowd, and Robb was alone at their table. "I must see to my son and daughter," he murmured. Lyanna nodded understandingly. Eddard gave Rhaegar another polite bow and made his way back through the press of bodies. He found Robb finishing his meal and looking around with wide eyes. "Father, can I go watch the dancers?" the boy asked eagerly, pointing to where a circle had formed around a group of performers. Eddard ruffled Robb's hair. "Yes, but mind your manners. I'll come find you soon." Robb grinned and bounded off, weaving into the crowd. Eddard smiled slightly, remembering his own younger days. The hall was growing stuffy, the crush of people making him long for fresh air. He spied a side door and slipped out into a torchlit courtyard. The sky above was scattered with stars, the air cool and refreshing. He strolled along the edge of the courtyard, letting the noise of the feast fade behind him. On the far side, he noticed a solitary figure leaning against the stone balustrade, looking out over the city lights. As Eddard approached, he recognized Oberyn Martell, the famed Red Viper of Dorne. Oberyn wore a rich coat of orange and gold, and his stance was casual, but Eddard sensed tension in the man. "Lord Stark," Oberyn said without turning. "Enjoying the festivities?" Eddard paused, placing a careful distance between them. "They're impressive. And you, Prince Oberyn?" Oberyn turned, a faint, predatory smile on his lips. "I find these feasts tedious, truth be told. All this talk of unity, while half the realm feuds behind the curtains. Tell me, do you truly believe the Martells have forgiven your sister for, how shall we say it, overshadowing my dear sister Elia?" Eddard remained calm. "I hope that King Rhaegar's arrangement brings no further harm to anyone." Oberyn gave a soft chuckle. "Diplomatic. I admire your restraint. Some men would have drawn steel over less. Perhaps your choice to avoid war all those years ago is the same impulse that guides your words now." Eddard held Oberyn's gaze. "What is it you want from me, Prince? You clearly have something to say." Oberyn leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I want to say that Dorne does not forget slights. Elia might keep her peace, but I know how she suffered. Rhaegar claims he loves her, and yet he also keeps your sister. He claims the realm is at peace, and yet my sister's honor was trodden upon. Someday, Lord Stark, we will see justice, or vengeance, whichever word you prefer." Eddard forced himself not to bristle. "You forget that my sister never sought to hurt Elia." Oberyn's eyes sparked like embers. "Do I forget? No, I remember everything. But let us not talk of it further. We wouldn't wish to spoil the king's party." He gave a mocking bow and stepped around Eddard, heading back inside. Eddard let out a breath. The Red Viper's words reminded him that not all resentments had faded. He stood in the courtyard a while longer, gazing at the stars. The faint echo of music drifted out from the hall. He thought of the tenuous web that Rhaegar was trying to hold together. Dorne's ire, the Ironborn's ambition, Robert Baratheon's bitterness, Tywin Lannister's cold calculations, each a spark waiting for kindling. Eventually, he returned inside, found Robb and Sansa, and steered them back to their quarters, for the hour was late. As he drifted off to sleep that night, he wondered whether the realm would indeed see peace for another generation or if new storms would break upon them all. The next morning's council meeting in the Lannister Solar confirmed some of Eddard's suspicions about looming troubles. Gathered around the table were King Rhaegar, Tywin Lannister, Kevan Lannister, Varys, Pycelle, Lord Tarly from the Reach, and Eddard. Rhaegar opened the discussion by mentioning the Ironborn's recent provocations. Tywin insisted they should dispatch a fleet to show the Iron Islands that defiance would not be tolerated. Lord Tarly agreed that swift action was best. Varys cautioned that Lord Balon might interpret a heavy-handed show of force as an excuse to rebel in earnest. Eddard spoke quietly. "I can reinforce the neck with more men, your grace, should the Ironborn try to sail into the Salt Spear or Fever River again. But the real question is whether Balon Greyjoy intends to openly defy the crown." Rhaegar nodded. "Agreed. I have no wish to start a war. My father once threatened to burn everything, but I will not follow that path. Perhaps we send envoys, offering Balon a seat at the table to discuss grievances. If he refuses, we can still keep the fleets on watch." Tywin's mouth curved in a slight sneer, but he inclined his head. "As you will, your grace. I only advise caution. Kindness is not a currency the Ironborn value." Rhaegar looked resolute. "It costs little to attempt peace before war. We'll begin with an invitation to Balon. If he spurns it, we respond accordingly." The meeting progressed to other matters: new taxes, trade with the free cities, and the upcoming harvest. Eventually, the king dismissed them. Eddard lingered for a moment, hoping to speak with Rhaegar privately, but Tywin claimed Rhaegar's ear immediately, leading him away to discuss finances. Eddard left the Solar, feeling uneasy. He spent the rest of the day watching some of the melee events with Robb and ensuring Sansa was safe among the ladies. As the sky darkened, the final feast of the tourney loomed. The crowd was thick, the city streets alive with revelry. Eddard, not fond of large crowds, walked a quieter route through Lannisport's side streets, taking in the architecture of grand houses and the flickering lamplight. He found a vantage point overlooking the harbor, where warships bearing the royal sigil bobbed on the tide. It was a reminder of the power that King Rhaegar wielded, but also a reminder of the challenges he faced in keeping the realm united. A voice spoke from behind him. "Lord Stark." He turned to see Ser Jaime Lannister, clad in his white cloak and a light breastplate. The young man held his helm under one arm, golden hair gleaming. "Ser Jaime," Eddard greeted, inclining his head. Jaime stepped beside him, looking out at the harbor. "You prefer solitude as well, it seems," Jaime remarked, half smiling. "I find it easier to think away from the crowds," Eddard said plainly. Jaime nodded. It was a fine tourney, perhaps not as grand as the one at Harrenhal years ago, but at least no hearts were broken or rebellion sparked. His tone had a trace of irony. Eddard recalled that Jaime had been a Kingsguard then as well, young and newly sworn. Eddard met Jaime's gaze. "We can be thankful for small mercies. Congratulations on your victory in the joust." Jaime shrugged. "It's what I do best, they say, but the real test of a knight is less glamorous. Standing guard, upholding vows, that sort of thing." His expression soured just a fraction. "I suspect I'll be guarding Rhaegar from the shadows for as long as he rules." Eddard chose his words carefully. The king is fortunate to have skillful men in his Kingsguard. Jaime looked at him sharply, as if seeking mockery, but Eddard's tone was sincere. Jaime glanced away, lips thinning. "Have you ever wondered, Lord Stark, what would happen if we all just set aside these vows and titles and did as we pleased?" Eddard frowned. "I cannot say I have. Duty is the pillar on which everything rests." Jaime gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Duty, yes, a lofty ideal. I learned a different lesson from my father and from the Mad King. But no matter." He turned back to Eddard. "You and I rarely speak, but I'll say this, you have my respect for preventing a war back then. I might not agree with everything that's come of it, but I'd rather not have half the realm burnt to ash by Aerys' whims." Eddard stiffened at the mention of Aerys, but he inclined his head. "Thank you, Sir Jaime. We did what we could to avert disaster." Jaime nodded once more. "Enjoy the evening, Lord Stark. I have guard duty soon." With that, he walked away, leaving Eddard alone again. The final feast passed in relative harmony, and the tourney concluded. The following morning, many lords began preparations to depart. Eddard gathered his children and men, preparing to ride back to the north. Once again, he exchanged parting words with King Rhaegar, who embraced Ned in a manner that was both kingly and fraternal. "Go safely, my friend," Rhaegar said. "I will send word regarding the Ironborn, and if you have any further news, do not hesitate to dispatch a raven." Eddard inclined his head. "I will. May the gods keep you well, your grace." He spared a final glance at Lyanna, who stood nearby with young Aemon. She did not speak, but her eyes conveyed a silent wish for his safe journey. Eddard bowed to her, then turned and helped Robb and Sansa onto their horses. They departed Lannisport amidst a bustle of carts and riders leaving for every corner of the realm. The journey home was peaceful, the weather fair. They stopped at Riverrun again, where Hoster Tully welcomed them. Sansa enjoyed playing in the castle gardens, and Robb sparred with some of the Tully squires. Then they headed north, eventually reaching Winterfell as the warmth of spring began to wane into a mild summer. Catelyn welcomed them back, overjoyed to see her children's faces alight with stories of knights and tournaments. Summer in the north was short, but for a time Winterfell basked in pleasant weather. The children played in the courtyards, and Eddard managed his affairs with a steady hand. Ravens came from time to time, bearing updates on the Ironborn negotiations. Lord Balon Greyjoy had grudgingly received the king's envoys, making vague promises of peace. Eddard remained wary, suspecting that the Ironborn's ambition was not easily quelled. But for the moment, no new raids were reported. As the year wore on, Eddard's thoughts turned more often to the future. He remembered Oberyn's words in Lannisport, that Dorne did not forget slights, and his encounter with Jaime about duty and vows. He recalled Robert's bitterness and Tywin's cold calculations. He knew that no arrangement could satisfy every house forever. Yet as long as King Rhaegar held the throne, wielding enough power to keep the realm in check, perhaps stability would hold. And if it ever faltered, Eddard hoped that he might again find a way to stave off destruction. Time flowed quietly in the north. Bran began to walk and babble. Arya grew ever more willful. Sansa blossomed into a gentle, courteous girl, and Robb grew taller and stronger, practicing swordplay under Roderick Castle's watchful eye. Catelyn grew busy with the tasks of running a large household, and Eddard found contentment in the routine of a lord's duties. Occasionally, at twilight, he would stand atop the walls of Winterfell, gazing out across the forested hills, the wind brushing his hair. He would remember the snow-laden yard of his childhood, playing with Brandon and Lyanna, chasing each other among the drifts. He would think of his father, the stern but fair man who had demanded justice from the Mad King. A wave of sorrow always rose then, mingled with a strange relief that, because of a single choice made years ago, the entire realm had been spared a terrible war. What, he wondered, might have happened if he had followed Robert's lead. The question ever haunted him, but he knew the answer well enough. The Seven Kingdoms would have likely been drenched in blood, with houses set ablaze, farmland trampled, and entire families shattered. Perhaps, in the end, Robert would have worn a new crown. Or perhaps the Targaryens would have unleashed wildfire that consumed the capital and beyond. In either case, untold thousands would have died. Now, at least they lived, albeit under a monarchy riddled with complexities. But life had a chance to go on, and children like Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and even Prince Aemon, Prince Aegon, Princess Rhaenys, none of them had to bear the scars of a great war. So Eddard Stark lived each day with a certain quiet acceptance of what had been lost and what had been gained. He had lost his father and brother to the Mad King's cruelty, but he had kept the North safe from a wider devastation. His friend Robert had lost Lyanna, but Lyanna lived and raised her child. The realm had lost a chance at a fresh dynasty, but gained the chance to avoid a drawn-out, ruinous conflict. There were no simple answers in a land where duty, honor, and ambition collided. Only the knowledge that the choice Eddard made had shaped the fate of countless lives, and for better or worse, he would stand by it. As the final rays of summer sun dipped below the horizon one evening, Eddard Stark found himself alone in the Godswood of Winterfell, kneeling before the ancient weirwood. Its face, carved in the bark, gazed at him with red, sap-like tears. He placed a hand on the cool trunk, letting the hush of the leaves surround him. A light wind murmured through the branches. He closed his eyes. "Father, Brandon," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I hope I have done right by the North and by our house. I hope you understand why I bent the knee instead of taking up arms. Though I cannot avenge you in the way most men would, I have tried to protect the people of the North and all the realm." He bowed his head, allowing a small measure of grief to rise and subside. When he opened his eyes, the weirwood's carved face seemed to stare into him, silent and implacable. The old gods did not answer in words, but in the rustle of leaves and the stillness of the air. Eddard rose, pressing his hand once more to the bark in farewell. He made his way back through the Godswood's dark canopy, stepping over twisting roots and soft moss. At the edge of the wood, the light of the castle torches glimmered, guiding him home. He entered the yard, where Catelyn stood with little Bran in her arms, smiling when she saw him approach. Arya ran about with a wooden practice sword, Robb trailing after her, telling her to be careful. Sansa, ever ladylike, was instructing a new puppy. The sight warmed Eddard's heart. Here was his present, his future. A family he cherished, safe within the walls of Winterfell. No matter what storms might brew in the realm beyond, as long as he could preserve this, he would count his choice as worth the price he had paid. So life went on. The realm did not burst into flames, nor did it bask in untroubled harmony. The seeds of discontent existed, in Dorne, in the Iron Islands, in Robert's broken heart, and in Tywin's iron grip on power. But as the years continued, King Rhaegar Targaryen ruled from the Iron Throne, guided by a careful hand, surrounded by a swirl of loyalties and grudges. And in the north, Eddard Stark, who had once prayed to the old gods for guidance on whether to join a rebellion, carried out his duties with quiet resolve, thankful that winter had not come for all the realm. From that day forward, bards in the taverns might sing of the Wolf's Choice, how Ned Stark's calm counsel tempered Robert Baratheon's rage, how Prince Rhaegar supplanted the Mad King without a single great battle, how Lyanna Stark became the mother of a Targaryen prince, and how the realm was spared a war that could have torn it apart. Some in the north honored Eddard for his wisdom. Others criticized him for letting Rickard and Brandon's deaths go unanswered by a tide of vengeful steel. But time moves inexorably forward, and the world changes with it. All that remained certain was that the choice Eddard Stark made reshaped the course of Westeros, creating a fragile peace that endured, at least for a time. And as long as that peace held, Eddard and many others could cling to hope that the next generation might know fewer ghosts and more gentle nights under the same stars that once gleamed upon the snow-laden battlements of Winterfell.